Today we're talking about the single most insane item change that we will see with patch 5.1 with season 5 if it actually makes it to life, which I really hope it doesn't. The item we're talking about is Deathbringer. I'll read out the change real quick and then we'll go into why it is absolutely mind-boggling that this even was allowed in the first place. Deathbringer and Malice have often competed for dominance, with the distinction being mostly an involved math equation to figure out which was better, with Deathbringer often winning. Deathbringer is being shifted to work better on gods that want to consistently crit like hunters. With a strong amount of critical strike with a smaller damage boost, its contrast with Malice is more clearly for gods with more ability-based crits. Yeah, well, that doesn't even work out at all, but let's go on here. Reduced cost from 3,000 to 2,800. With no explanation, by the way. None of the reasons above explains why this would have a price decrease when it was already a very strong item. Increased critical strike chance from 20% to 35%. Reduced passive critical strike damage buff from 40% to 25%. So somebody must have thought by just, adding 15% crit chance and taking 15% off the extra damage, that would somehow even out. It doesn't really, because it's not all the extra damage that's being dealt. There's another 100% extra damage that happens before that, which is part of the crit. So this calculation really was completely off if it was done. Looking at the numbers makes it more likely that the calculation was actually never done. They just kind of fiddled around with the numbers and were like, oh, let's try out what happens if we do this, rather than what will that actually lead to and what are the numbers behind that. Every other change that I've seen in this patch is at least somewhat understandable to me. I'm not agreeing with all of them, heck no, I'm not agreeing with a lot of them actually, but I can understand why they've been done in the way they've been done, and I can understand why Hi-Res, or at least some people at Hi-Res that were responsible for those items, thought that it could be a good change. This one is the outlier, the exception, the one where everything just went wrong. Do you realize that Rod of Tahuti was nerfed because it was such a dominant item in the mage meta? It was that item that everyone built. Well, when it came to hunter crit builds, that was Deathbringer. There were niche builds, very niche builds, that were Poison Star and Wind Demon, but that's mostly because those items are just cheaper and they provide you with other benefits that aren't directly damage related, and you can just get them early in the match, so there's the reason to build that. But if you had the chance to, you would always go into Deathbringer because the damage application from Deathbringer was just way above anything else at that point, especially as a secondary crit item, which was usually the purpose of this. So did Deathbringer need any buffs to begin with? Any price reduction? It really didn't. It was really strong, and if anything, it probably was more likely to need nerfs to even it more with other crit items. Now, crit wasn't the most dominant item choice for many, especially with so many tanks around. We would often see kin size builds and double pen builds and things like that, which, was understandable at the time, and that was something that Hi-Res wanted to move away from, so their conclusion was to buff crit, I guess. But buffing Deathbringer was not the way to go. Now, first of all, it's important in this context as well that kin size wasn't actually buffed. After I looked into it further, it's very likely that in most cases it was either nerfed or evened out. So that's kind of out of the window, so kin size was in the same place, but crit gets buffed. And the balance between both kins and crit is always a wonky one. It can shift depending on the meta, depending on the gods and everything. And well, right now we will probably see a shift anyways, because tanky builds aren't worth as much anymore for various reasons, also related to the mage items and things like that. So crit was gonna come back to some degree anyways. But with this change, crit's on the table every single day for pretty much every single hunter. And not only the hunters actually, I would build it on pretty much every single AA assassin as well, including those that would normally primarily go into kins like Bakasura, and I would also build it on pretty much any ability-based god in a last slot for Deathbringer at least, because at that point of the game it will give you so much more damage than anything from the penetration trees or anything like that ever could. To understand this, let's look at some items and their damage values. Now, this isn't 100% representative. As usual, you can only factor in so many circumstances. What I did here is I took Arcanunos on level 20 with Death Toll, which we won't have anymore, but we will have similar damage items that you can get early. Ninja Tabi, Devourer's Gauntlet, and Executioner. This is the point of the game where you can typically start considering going into crit. This is the point of the game where you could get a kin size otherwise, but if you're going for straight crit, this is where you could get your first crit. So the power you will have is 130 plus whatever that crit item that you build afterwards will give you. The attack speed you will have is 1.73. What does it give us for various crit items? If we were to use Wind Demon, we'd end up with 389 DPS. That is, assuming we are able to get the passive off beforehand, so we have the extra attack speed. Pretty good starting value. With Rage, we would have 397 DPS. Slightly higher, this is due to the full stacks of Rage giving you a lot of crit chance, but Rage itself doesn't have a crazy amount of power, and you know, it takes a while to stack it up as well. Then we go on, and we have Deathbringer as it is in the current 4-point-something version, 4.25, so on the current live client. 398 DPS. 398. That is pretty high, but it's also not that far off from where Wind Demon or Rage are. We have a 10 extra DPS on Wind Demon, and pretty much the same as Rage if you were to just build Deathbringer. And Deathbringer itself is pretty expensive. So obviously, it would take a fair amount of investment to get there and to get this damage value. Then we have Malice. Malice, the single highest damage crit item, if you consider that you have to get the full tick off and you can't get another crit in the meantime. So already a lot of conditions tied to that. But this item can, theoretically, if the full tick runs through and everything else works out like you want it to, get up to 420 DPS with this build. This is not necessarily the highest that can be reached. There's like interactions with Hydra's Lament, where Deathbringers can possibly outclass it and things like that. But that's realistically the highest we can go. And if you get more than one crit item, then Malice power will already fall off. Malice is just that good as a single crit item, because if you have multiple crit items, then the chance of the passive proccing at the wrong time and basically not running through once properly before the next crit happens is already almost too high. So this is ideal for Malice, and Malice is now 20 DPS above Deathbringer roughly, or 20 DPS above Rage roughly. So keep that number in mind. 20 DPS difference for the most ideal condition for the item that is best suited as a single crit item. And all the others are somewhere around a 10 DPS difference pretty much. Poison Star a little bit weaker, but that has other benefits. Now let's look at New Deathbringer. New Deathbringer with the same items, everything else being the same, would be at 447 DPS. I will just let that insanity sink in for a moment. It is at 447 DPS. This single item gets a 50 DPS increase over what it was previously through this new buff and through this change. It has almost 30 DPS more than Malice, meaning that it has an increase that is more like almost 1.5 times that what Malice was previously over the other crit items because of its benefit as a single crit item. For Deathbringer, this benefit applies as a single crit item, but Deathbringer is also incredibly strong when combined with other crit items, so it actually benefits even more from that. It has no downside that Rage has, where it has to be stacked first, and still has more DPS than Rage. It has 50 DPS more than Rage, with the only downside being that you have to wait 400 gold. I'm pretty sure that if you can get 5 stacks on Rage, you can also get 400 gold just from the kills that made that happen. So yeah, I don't think there's any reason to build Rage over Deathbringer ever with this change. Really, you have an identical crit chance to an item that needs 5 stacks to reach the same crit chance, and only reaches a major chunk of that crit chance once it is on 5 stacks. At the same time, you also have the power of the highest power crit items, like Malice being the other one, and the power of many high power items in the game. There's not that many items that actually go above 50 power. This makes Deathbringer so beneficial in every single regard. It makes Deathbringer so good that it should be the first crit item that you're investing into, because everything else is so close in the price range that's just worth waiting for that 400 extra gold or whatever, or less than that, to get the full benefit here. It makes Deathbringer so good that you should probably build it on any ability-based assassin in the last item slot if you didn't build crit beforehand anyways, because it just gives you so much extra damage with such a high crit chance, and it's still a high power item anyways. It's not like this was completely out of the window before. It's not like something that we've never seen before. It's just so much better now. To put this a little more into perspective, if we were to nerf Deathbringer and we lower the crit chance down to 30% instead of 35, right? You know, bringing it a line a little bit more, it would still be the best crit item in any god. It would then sit at 428 DPS, which is still 8 DPS above Malice, when Malice is more expensive and should be the single best crit item in the game. Even gods that should benefit more from having Malice because they only get a single crit or they get a guaranteed crit chance or something like Naja, like Hunbaz, will still be so much better off with Deathbringer because the chance of actually getting that crit is so much higher, and outside of that one chance where you can get it, every single basic has such a higher chance to crit as well that it's just pretty much unavoidable to go into this item. If you haven't grasped the insanity quite yet, I'm not blaming you because it's just a lot to take in just how crazy this item is. Put this in perspective a little more. If we had no crit chance at all and only the power that Deathbringer provided, which also not that many items have, you would get 311 DPS. So overall, if we're talking about 447 DPS, that's almost a 50% increase of damage output in a single item, which was previously roughly 1/3. And if you don't understand the implications of this, just imagine every hunter getting crit from mid-game on when the enemy is kind of building their situational defenses and defense items being nerfed anyways. Every squishy is still finishing up their core items and doesn't have any chance to really go into defense options or like anything like that yet. And then you have gods like Mercury outside of that as well that will crit you down so hard so early in the game that you don't even want to play anymore. You know that Stonecutting Sword is around the same price range as Deathbringer. You know that Mercury players used to build Stonecutting Sword quite early into the game in a very early slot because it was so accessible and so strong. Yeah, that's Deathbringer now. Have fun with those crits. Deathbringer in its current state is insane, and I do not want to see this on live at all. And with that, thank you guys for watching. I hope this was informative, and I hope this opened those eyes that weren't open yet. I think a lot of you knew about how strong it was already, but maybe didn't quite grasp just how insane the numbers behind it as well. See you for the next one tomorrow. If you're new to the channel, feel free to click the sub button and maybe the bell. It really helps me out. DukeSloth, out. So I actually figured out my demonetization issue, and it was my outro. As such, feel free to click any of the links around here right now. There will be new outro music as soon as I find something nice. Until then, as you guys requested, I will do the outro music myself. You're welcome.